So I would like in turn to start by thanking the organizers, especially Mihriban and Guinness, for this invitation to present in this series dedicated to the memory and legacy of Ofer Bar Yosef, as well as the moderator Mary Steiner for kindly agreeing to enter a woodland no man's zone, you know, and manage this evening's session. I hope we won't let you down. I will start now sharing my presentation, so bear with me. Is this visible to everybody? Thank you very much.
Yes, perfect.
So today, Ceren and I will present our work examining long-term trends in plant subsistence practices, focusing primarily in the Eastern Fertile Crescent, but at the same time, we set this in the context of results from other sites in the region and beyond the region on a few occasions. And our time span for the purpose of this presentation will be primarily the Epipaleolithic and the early Aceramic Neolithic. Work on earlier materials alluded to by Mary's introduction, especially in reference to Ceren's project, refers to materials dated to the Upper and the Middle Paleolithic. This is currently ongoing, and quite an interesting batch of results has already been submitted to journals for publication. Given that these are currently under review and they represent the results of original work undertaken primarily by Ceren, we will not make direct reference to them in this presentation, but we will be happy to answer questions as they may arise in the context of the wider presentation. Oops. So while we aim to bring the talk to a conclusion by offering some new perspectives on the question of the transition from foraging to farming across Western Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean, as I mentioned already, the bulk of the evidence and the temporal focus is on assemblages derived from the eastern part of the Fertile Crescent, that is, Eastern Anatolia and the northwestern and central Zagros. This doesn't necessarily mean that areas such as the Western Fertile Crescent, notably the Levant, as well as the Iranian Plateau, the rest of Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Aegean are any less important. But we wish to emphasize that the picture within the Fertile Crescent, and in some cases outside it, reveals greater diversity than what is often acknowledged, and for different reasons than those promoted by scholars, sometimes fixated on crop domestication and the evolution of early cultivars. As we hope to demonstrate tonight, there are important insights that can be obtained by querying more closely this diversity. So, the time span. First of all, Paleolithic sites that have been excavated and published in the eastern arc of the Fertile Crescent cover a time span of tens of thousands of years. However, Upper Paleolithic and Epipaleolithic, especially predating the Younger Dryas, sites are thus far mostly limited to the Zagros range, and of these, only those marked in red here, that is Shanitar Cave and Yafte Cave from Upper Paleolithic and Palegara Cave from the Epipaleolithic predating the Younger Dryas, have provided reliable finds of charred plant remains to date. In the first part of the talk, we will present published results from one of these sites, Palegara, located in the Suleymaniya region of northern Iraq. Moving on to the later part of the time span dealt with in today's presentation, we will focus on the evidence from sites dating to the late Epipaleolithic, coeval with the Younger Dryas and the Terminal Pleistocene, and the early Aceramic Neolithic. Such sites in this part of the region where we are focusing today are located in eastern Anatolia, as well as the northern and central Zagros. In comparison to earlier periods, there are significantly more excavated sites, as this map aptly demonstrates, most of which, however, were occupied during the start of the Holocene. Sites with phases, there we are, sites with phases dating from the Terminal Pleistocene and the Younger Dryas are marked here with this cute white dots, while all sites with published archaeobotanical finds are underlined in green. Several sites have not yielded archaeobotanical remains despite sampling efforts, and I refer specifically here to the site of Karim Shahir, which was one of the sites test-trenched by our Eastern Fertile Crescent Prehistory project, to which I will refer to in a moment, or have yielded poorly preserved low-density samples or hold assemblages that have not been fully analyzed and or published yet. So let's start with Palegara Cave. Palegara Cave in the foothills of northwestern Zagros was first excavated in 1951, followed by a second season in 1955 by Bruce Howe and Bob Brightwood as part of the Iraq Jarmo project, supported by the Chicago Oriental Institute and the American Schools of Oriental Research. This expedition came in the footsteps of the pioneer work undertaken by Dorothy Garrod in 1928 at Suleimaniya, excavating the late Paleolithic sites of Zarzi and Hazar Merd. 7 decades later, it took us a while, I, together with Douglas Baird, initiated the Eastern Fertile Crescent Prehistory Project. And this is a research collaboration between the University of Liverpool and the Suleimaniya Directorate of Antiquities and Heritage. As I mentioned already, it is directed by me with Douglas and Kamal Rashid, the director of the Suleimaniya Directorate, as we are all co-directors, and the project core specialist team whose work made this project possible includes Ceren, who dealt with the archaeobotany and quantitative and Bayesian analysis, Louise Martin, who is here, I think, with us today, who together with Kate Swinson dealt with zooarchaeology, Emma Jenkins from Bournemouth dealing with phytoliths and starts, Aroa Garcia Suarez, the soil micromorphologist, Jess Pearson, osteoarchaeology and stable isotopes, myself dealing as ever with charcoals, and Doug dealing with his lithics. The main project aims. The research focus has been the time span between 20,000 and 11,000, roughly speaking, calibrated years before present. This is represented in the northwest Zagros by the Epipaleolithic, also known as Zarzian, and the so-called proto-Neolithic, mostly covering the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene chronocultural horizons. Our main objectives have been and are to investigate the chronology, habitation patterns, and resource management practices, including plants, animals, and raw material sources from this period in the Iraqi northwest Zagros. And very importantly, and we hope that this will be the main focus of renewed activity now that the pandemic has finally decided to leave us alone, to compare to undertake fieldwork that will permit us to compare our finds to contemporaneous entities known from the Iranian central and southern Zagros, as well as Anatolia and the Levant. Specifically, the main research aim is to investigate the nature, socioeconomic, and ecological contexts of the last hunter-gatherer habitations in the Northwest Zagros corridor of this arc, including, crucially, potential links and interactions with the Anatolian Upper Tigris Basin to the northwest and the Iranian Central Zagros to the southeast. So, Palegara Cave. Palegara is situated in the Slemani region of Iraqi Kurdistan. You can see the location of the site marked here in red. On a limestone ridge flanking the Basian Valley of the Northwest Zagros foothill zone. It's quite low, located at an altitude of about 854 meters above sea level. There is, I apologize for that, sorry, there we are. A cave and a rock shelter complex facing to the southeast, as indicated in this image, of which only the middle cave, marked here as PG2, has provided evidence of prehistoric habitation. There we are. Brightwood and Howe had excavated to the bedrock the main chamber of the cave, but had left the terrace in front of the cave and the threshold of the cave unexcavated. Over 2 short seasons in 2016 and 2017, and you can see snapshots from both here on the upper left-hand side, we sunk 2 test trenches, A and B. And in 2017, we focused most of our effort in A. Initial results had suggested that it held greater potential regarding the density of its plant and faunal assemblages and the integrity and phasing of its stratigraphy. You can see here to the right pictures of the bedrock as revealed in Trench A. Area A had evidence for in situ activities, which was important, as well as dumping from what was the likely focus of late Pleistocene activity in the main cave chamber excavated by Howe. In 2017, we extended their Trench A further in towards the cave, the main cave chamber, and we excavated to the bedrock. We reached the bedrock at depths of approximately 1 meter, 1.20 meters, representing always the depth of late Pleistocene deposits below the topsoil layer. A very important aspect of our project and a key driving objective was flotation sampling. Flotation sampling was applied at 100% of all undisturbed, that is, without any evidence for root action or large roots or, animal holes, burrowing holes of epipaleolithic deposits. Machine-assisted flotation was applied throughout. Given the nature of the sediment matrix and the volume of the samples, any other processing method would have been completely inefficient for the recovery of charred plant remains and animal bone from 100% of the excavation deposits. We also predicted, based on previous work and previous hypotheses and debate in the literature, that the density of plant remains would have been particularly low. So we had to maximize recovery, and that was the only realistic strategy through which this could have been achieved. Until our excavations at Palegara, the Zagros Epipaleolithic continued to lack reliable radiocarbon chronologies. Previous attempts detailed in the major publication produced in 2020 and published in PLOS One in September of 2020 as an open access article had provided a relatively late chronology for the site. A key objective of our project was to obtain AMS radiocarbon dates. To this purpose, we dated single entity specimens of the same short-lived species, that is, single items, not bulk charcoal samples comprising multiple fragments, focusing exclusively on one species, almond, which was present in charcoal and nutshell and was ubiquitous throughout the excavated and sampled sequence. Our work, our assays extended the chronology of the cave compared to previous estimations by about 2,000 years. So we were able to ascertain that the chronology of Palegara starts from approximately the later part of the last glacial maximum at circa 19,600 calibrated BP, that is model dates, and the cave use was continuous through the late Pleniglacial. There appears to be a short break in the excavated in the dated sequence that is likely to indicate more sporadic visitations during the extremely dry conditions of the Heinrich event 1, also known as the older Dryas, at about 16.2 K cal BP. But the use of the cave resumed in the late glacial, also known as the Boiling Allerode. No dates, we have obtained no dates yet from the uppermost part of the latest excavated and stratigraphic phase of Palegara, phase 3, but the Bayesian modeling done by Ceren suggests a likely end of deposition, late Paleolithic deposition in area A at about 13,200 calibrated BP. There could have been later habitation mixed near the top of the sequence previously excavated by Howe, but this cannot be resolved at present based on the evidence available from the new excavations. Although this is not the place to discuss in detail the faunal data, which have been presented in superb detail in the publication, work by Kate Swinson and Louise Martin has revealed a very diverse mammalian assemblage, reflecting a mosaic of habitats from grasslands to shrublands and woodlands, as grasslands, for example, are indicated by equids, to shrublands and woodlands, as represented by deer and oxen, steppes with the presence of gazelle, mountains, the wild goats, to wetlands, wild boar. I have to emphasize also that tortoise was very common in the assemblage, as well as birds, fish, and microfauna were also very, very well represented. So that the faunal analysis to begin with gave us a very good indication that the range of habitats were routinely exploited by the prehistoric inhabitants, the late Paleolithic inhabitants of Palegara throughout the period of the cave use and occupation. Another significant achievement of our project in the context of the regional Epipaleolithic was the recovery, this time for the first time, of a sizable charred plant assemblage. 3 major plant groups are represented: nuts, seeds, sedges, and tubers. looking at this into some greater detail, nuts were overwhelmingly dominated by almond nutshell, as well as very few poorly preserved fragments tentatively identified as pistachia. We have seeds, notably legumes, especially vicia and lathyrus, but also a number of small and large seeded grasses, as you can see here, and also wild type barley. Preliminary phytolith results also point to the use of wetland taxa such as sedges, while starch preservation seems to support the macro-remain evidence for plant use and processing activities at the site. The overall reliance on almond nuts is corroborated by the anthracological data, showing the dominant presence, the dominant presence of almond charcoal alongside the less abundant, if quite ubiquitous, deciduous oak charcoal, images of which you can see here. There was also a riparian woods component, notably salicaceae, but also with the occasional finds of ash wood charcoal. Overall, the combined wood and non-wood char plant macro remains, alongside the preliminary phytolith results that are presented in detail in the published paper, agree with the faunal data that both a range of wetland and open woodland, grassland habitats and ecotones were routinely exploited throughout the epipaleolithic habitation at Palegara. A comparison with the long pollen sequence published in its finalized form in 2008 by Van Zeist, obtained from the Lake Zeribar in the Iranian Zagros, underscores the importance of archaeobotanical macro remains for paleoecological reconstruction, not just in this region, but in a way that applies equally across the inland regions of Southwest Asia. The ice core chronostratigraphy that you can see to the left here correlated with the Lake Zeribar phasing and pollen assemblage zones as detailed by Van Zeist and co-authors. And here, overlain in blue, this is the overlap with the Palegara chronology as established by the results of our project. Demonstrate that literally what we have found in the archaeobotanical assemblage is not reflected almost at all in the regional pollen data. And you can see that also here from the result, from the summary pollen diagram published by Van Zeist. So you see that there is very, very little evidence for any kind of woodland vegetation present at this part of the sequence. This is the reason for this are simple. Both the almonds, as well as the salicaceae and some other entomophilous or poor pollen producers that were present in the charcoal, that holds for pistachia too, are always underrepresented or completely absent from pollen diagrams. Significantly, Zeribar sequence shows also no oak, whereas we have found oak, at least oak charcoal is ubiquitous in the Palegara assemblage. But then again, this can be explained by the fact that Lake Zeribar is situated in a high altitude catchment close to the rain shadow of the Zagros, and it is intensely cold. By comparison, Palegara is situated at a much lower altitude in a sheltered valley near watercourses, which explains the presence of oak wood charcoal, and at the same time disproves previous contentions that the Zagros was virtually treeless before the start of the Holocene. Moving on to the early Holocene. And now we move to Eastern Anatolia, still reporting on published primary data resulting from projects that we have undertaken. We are going to talk here about the archaeobotanical assemblage from the pre-pottery Neolithic site of Győr-Hoyuk that was published in 2021 in a multi-authored paper in Scientific Reports. The deposits sampled from archaeobotanical remains are indicated here in yellow, either squares or surfaces here, and you can also see them indicated here. The pre-pottery Neolithic A plant exploitation component, and we only talk here about phases that were sampled and provided radiocarbon dates associated with the particular remains. The chronology that you see here should not be taken as a representative of the chronology of the site as a whole. These are just the dates corresponding to the sampled deposits. So the part of the sampled sequence that has been directly dated to a period corresponding to the PPNA chronological horizon shows that plant exploitation focused on nuts. Both almond as well as pistachia are dominant. Alongside, there is also a very significant legume component, most notably lentils, but also Vicia erbilia and Vicia lathyrus. And you can see here examples of these as published and already available. There is the almond nutshell and the pistachia, and the lentils, as well as the Vicia down here. Oops. Charcoal finds also indicate a relatively well-established semi-arid woodland dominated by almond. The pistachia with the deciduous oak component. So pistachia here, almond here. There is the deciduous oak. There is also some birch wood, possibly representing driftwood, or specially selected timber from possibly from more upland catchments. The limited set of contexts available from which archaeobotanical assemblages were available for analysis and were all again dated to the early pre-pottery Neolithic B period, suggest mostly continuity with earlier periods. We have, for example, still the lentils and the legumes and the almonds and the pistachia, but significantly, there is a very important component of small-seeded legumes as well as grasses, especially wheat progenitor species, as well as aegilops, which was really, really interesting in this context. Here you can see examples from of plant remains retrieved from early PPNB contexts. There are the lents, there is the lentils, the Vicia lathyrus still, as well as some small-seeded legumes and wetland plants. There is in the charcoal, in contrasting with earlier periods, a significant component of riparian woods, especially ashwood, charcoal. Wheats and aegilops, as I mentioned earlier, and you show in the table, are relatively well preserved and represented. Morphologically, the wild einkorn and emmer wheat are of the wild type. We should also note here that the narrow focus on specific legume taxa during both the PPNA and early PPNB phases, and the exclusive presence of cereal crop progenitors in the early PPNB are interesting in themselves. Why they are interesting? This is because we know from ecological studies that in terms of their availability, Cereals likely grew in sympatric formations with wild pulses. So the assemblage in itself does seem to suggest that it is heavily, quite possibly heavily impacted by intentional cultural choices. Last but not least, wheat grains that you see are distinctly smaller, as you can see by the PCA analysis undertaken by Ceren, are distinctly smaller than those reported from Chayunu, for example, which is the red circle here for this particular time span. Considering the dating of these finds at Yusir, as well as the apparent continuity in the presence of other plant components with the PPNA assemblage, this is likely to reflect a local development of a shift towards the management of cereal crop progenitors during the early PPNP. And I'm sure Ceren will be happy to answer detailed questions many of you may have in this regard after the end of this presentation. So, looking at the regional data dated to the Paleolithic, there is a limited number of sites in terms of epipaleolithic. Only one from the Eastern Fertile Crescent, another from Anatolia, I think that's Karaim B and Kuzini here, with reliable assemblages, and that is not to the east. Adding to this picture, other sites, especially an assemblage of sites from the Levant, and as well as earlier sites such as Kebara Cave, Mughal Hamama from the Jordan Valley, as well as Theopetra Cave in central Greece and the Frankthi Cave in southern mainland Greece, we get a bigger Eastern Mediterranean picture. Again, as I said, there are materials here that we are not making direct reference to from the Eastern Fertile Crescent for reasons already emphasized. So what we see here is that nuts such as amygdalus and pistachia, that is almond and wild pistachio nuts, as well as legumes, Vicia in particular lens, but also other legumes, are quite common. This demonstrates an overriding pattern of reliance on nuts and pulses going back several tens of thousands of years. The only sites sort of that seem to stand out is Ohala II, dated to the early or late Upper Paleolithic, early Paleolithic, we basically coinciding with the LGM, and to some extent other sites in that part of the Levant, such as El Wad, the Derige Cave, and Abu Huraira I, which is late Epipaleolithic, dating to the Younger Dryas. But even so, there is a more overt reliance on grasses there. This is more visible in Ohala II, but again, this might reflect, to some extent at least, taphonomic biases. Remember that Ohala II is an open-air site, okay, that has had exceptional preservation of, especially by waterlogging, of seed plants, or there might be unknown context-related variation that is underreported. In this respect, contrasted with the late Epipaleolithic Abu Huraira, where again, the nuts, especially the pistachia, as well as the legumes, are very, very well represented. Moving on to the picture from the Eastern Fertile Crescent for sites dated to the terminal Pleistocene, that is the Younger Dryas, and the start of the Holocene. Similarly to Epipaleolithic assemblages, there is a strong emphasis on the use of nuts. Again, almond and pistachia appear to be ubiquitous and dominant, as well as a broader range of legumes, now featuring lentils more prominently, and in some cases, a much greater emphasis on legumes. There is, by contrast, very limited evidence for a reliance on cereal crop progenitors, although they are a range of sites. And paleoecologically speaking, there is no reason to assume that they were not abundant in the regional vegetation. In some sites, notably Gyusir and Chayunu, they gained prominence, cereal crop progenitors, during the early PPNB, indicating their increasing importance in local culinary traditions. Be that as it may, such a low-level reliance on cereal crop relatives is interesting for the paleoecological reasons already explained, as well as the fact that by all accounts, it doesn't really show a level of discontinuity that would be normally expected from traditional, if you want, narratives about, at least archaeobotanically informed narratives about agricultural origins in the region. Thus, for a significant period prior to the mid-9th millennium BC, cereal crop progenitors, unlike the legumes and nuts, appear to have been marginal in regional plant practices and plant uses. Another exception here is Choga Golan in the Iranian central Zagros, and is one of the very few eastern fertile crescents with a PPNA plant assemblage containing significant proportions of wild-type barley. By contrast, other grasses, especially small and large non-progenitor taxa, were important and were used, especially in northern Iraq, as well as the Iranian Zagros. If we add here, for the sake of the argument, and because I like throwing stones in waters, the Frankfurt cave assemblage. The Frankfurt cave assemblage, not the late Pleistocene one, but the early Holocene one, dates to the same chronological horizon. Okay, so 9th millennium. In the Aegean, the 9th millennium represents the lower Mesolithic. The assemblage, as previously published by Julie Hansen, underscores further this picture of continuity in plant use during this period with the preceding Epipaleolithic, in Greek terms, Upper Paleolithic and Final Paleolithic horizon. Frankfurt comprises a very well preserved stratified assemblage. It has chronological overlap with the Eastern Fertile Crescent sites, thus providing very interesting insights into broader patterns in hunter-gatherer plant subsistence across the Eastern Mediterranean. There is increasing use of grasses at Frankfurt during the early Holocene, being added to an existing plant subsistence tradition of nut and legume use, and this is very well demonstrated and is in line with shifts observed in regions that are far removed geographically, at least, from Frankfurt in the Eastern Fertile Crescent. Now, I haven't spoken yet about the elephant in the room, and that is what's happening in the Western Fertile Crescent, especially the Levant. Well, with many, many apologies, because I did not have the time to make nice gray boxes of the multitude of sites in the Levant. I have an older table. I'm sure many of you will find it out of date, but in its core it stands. And what do we have here? Similarities can't be immediately observed. So nuts, such as almonds and pistachia, and certain groups of legumes, especially the lentils and the veggies, as well as small seeded grasses, are also well represented. On the other hand, there is a much greater reliance in the Western Fertile Crescent on cereal crop progenitors during this period. Note, for example, the preponderance of barley across the northern and southern Levant, as you can see here. The ubiquity of emmer wheat in the south and of acorn wheat in the north, especially in northern Syria and southeast Anatolia, compared to the eastern fertile crescent sites we talked about already. The dominance of arboreal taxa such as fig also almost certainly reflects region-specific culinary choices, and many authors have commented on this in the past. So, to conclude, what do we get from an integrated view of plant food choices and subsistence from the Epipaleolithic through to the early pre-pottery Neolithic in this region? What we can't see and we can't tell for sure based on the presently available evidence is that this was heavily based on almonds and legumes. In most cases, these represent pulses, alongside various grasses, including non-cereal crop progenitors, together with wild barley and tubers. Palegara provides the first verified antecedent of what was probably an enduring pattern of plant use across the Taurus-Zagros arc. And I'm talking here specifically about Eastern Anatolia, the Upper Tigris Basin, and northwestern Iraq. Nuts and legumes, more generally speaking, were plants of choice across the Eastern Mediterranean. And it is important to emphasize here that both almond and pistachia wood charcoal are also, in most cases, the dominant charcoal taxa, okay, at many sites, including earlier sites, that is Middle and Upper Paleolithic sites. We have to think, therefore, about these semi-arid woodland habitats, especially in inland sites of inland Southwest Asia, as a very old process that goes well beyond, well back in time, possibly going all the way back to the Middle Paleolithic or even earlier. Such continuous engagement of humans with these particular habitats that were intensively managed over tens of thousands of years, both for fuel and for food, certainly contributed to the creation of resilient, long-lived vegetation niches. Okay, we need therefore to refine, redefine, revisit our understanding of human needs construction, and that goes well past the conceptual straitjacket of such, by now, somewhat tired concepts such as pre-domestication, cultivation, and focus instead, shift our attention to the researching enduring, long-lived ecological inheritances in the region. Not least important is the fact that both nuts and legumes are not things you can just go out and collect and consume. They both require complex processing sequences and technologies, and the latter are not necessarily associated with an abundance of groundstone implements to render them safely edible by humans and to convert them into processed foodstuffs. Tubers are also included in this. Oily nuts were also likely used for meat preservation, flavoring, and processing. And the presence of this taxa offers tantalizing hints about the complexity of these early culinary cultures or pre-agricultural culinary cultures for which we still know very little. We now have additional evidence from Paleolithic sites in the region to support similar hypotheses with primary data, and these are currently submitted for publication and under review. I also would like to throw here into question a concept that has been fairly well established in, again, archaeobotanical narratives. I'm not talking here about the zooarchaeological aspects. Broad spectrum, what is broad spectrum in pre-agricultural plant use? And how do we measure at the end of the day broad spectrum? Are we talking about botanically determined species or plant groups that were probably closer to the experience of the people exploiting these specific plants back in the past? We also have to think about possible impacts of taphonomy or habitation practices. For example, how do we compare cave versus rock shelter versus open air dwellings? How do we deal with unknown context-related variation? How do we deal with the possible inputs of secondary foods, non-food uses, background noise, and so on? I've already spoken about the regional differences, and I'm not going to repeat that here. I would like just to re-emphasize the point that this, in my opinion, does not reflect primarily environmental availability. Cereals were present, if not dominant, at several Eastern Anatolian and Zagros sites, but I strongly suspect, and on that I and Ceren are mostly in agreement, that they might reflect differences in culinary cultures, practices, and traditions. In Anatolia, we see significant changes in plant subsistence with the take-up of wheat management from the early PPNB, and that crucially coincides with the beginning of intensive caprine management. Changes in plant use may or may not have been more gradual, but all the evidence seems to square on the fact that the onset of mixed agropastoral lifeways that radically changed people's engagements with plants in the landscape took place in the space of less than 1,000 years. Okay? This in itself puts a large question mark on the viability of the concept of pre-domestication cultivation. Okay? Followed by the adoption of mixed farming as a protracted process that lasted for several millennia. In Anatolia, at least, this does not seem to be the case. So, was it all a prelude to agriculture? I don't know. My answer is, I don't think so. At least in synchronic terms, people didn't see themselves as being on the road to becoming, domesticated farmers, whatever. Okay, maybe it's our heads that are stuffed with cereal ears and grain that can't see a different version of the past. But I would like, again, to draw your attention, and here I verge completely into unknown territory, that what we are dealing here are two different concepts. There is food production as a process, and that has to do with foraging choices, cultivation, harvesting, processing, the investigation of agroecologies, and this archaeobotany, as presently constituted, is supremely well equipped to address. But there is also resource selection and use as cultural choices, that is membership in specific culinary cultures, the surface of which in Southwest Asia we have just begun to scratch. Paleolithic culinary cultures remain the great unknown. Paleolithic plant use is still treated in the literature primarily as a means for provisioning calories and nutrients. Very little attention has been paid until now to culinary choices, which are implicitly deemed as the preserve of complex or advanced societies and not lowly hunter-gatherers. But think about it for a moment. What we eat is culturally fixed. It is very deeply connected to how we see ourselves and our role in society. And as I have, through my engagement and our exposure, especially to the new Anatolian data, as well as reading through older work as well, The transition from foraging to farming represents foremost a reconfiguration of regional culinary cultures and traditions. The Anatolian evidence may still be PSML, but it shows that this reconfiguration took place in the space of centuries rather than millennia. And more encouragingly, if you want, it is archaeologically traceable. So, new introductions to culinary repertoires, for example, cereal grass exploitation, may have been initially treated and accordingly themselves behaved as singular individual things, innovations in the making in different contexts. Of these early manifestations and interactions, often reduced in the literature to restrictive terms, such as pre-domestication cultivation, which is literally taken as an analog to later fixed horticulture, we still know very little. Their treatment as signifiers of agriculture presupposes that they have evolved into vectors, for example, crop staples, in a new regimented system that is a well-defined, distinctive agroecology. As the technology of their management advances and becomes standardized, and new anthropogenic habitats replace the old landscape settings. However, this is a process very different to classic archaeobotanical narratives of crop domestication, crop evolution, all converging into agricultural origins in an almost inescapable process. Thank you. And yep, sorry, last slide. Thank you. Thanks to everybody, especially the Eastern Fertile Crescent Prehistory Project co-directors and the field team that, you know, deserves the greatest credit for all the work we did and all the data we have managed to assemble. And now I will stop sharing my presentation and give the reins back to Mary.
Well, let me just say thank you for a fascinating talk. You definitely lived up to the praises that I offered in the beginning.
Not just me.
Both of you. Both of you. Absolutely, both of you. Let's see. I expect there are a number of questions, or people are still formulating them in their minds. We could take them, I think, two ways. One is to raise your hand. And we can take them that way, or if it's more convenient to go through the chat, I also have that open too, especially for those of you with a not so great video service. So we'll wait a second or two and see what people come up with. Aha. Our first one is from Yuge. Yuge, would you like to ask? You need to unmute yourself.
Hello, thanks for the talk. I was just thinking, and meanwhile, I think I just pressed the hand button. So I was just thinking about everything. Yeah. You've been talking, so if possible, I can come up with a question.
Why not? Who could be better?
Yeah. Thanks again.
I think Füsun has her hand up. Füsun R2.
Yes. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please, Füsun.
And I'm still also developing my question, but we may develop together.
Yeah.
After having this ethnobotanical study in central Anatolia, I started to think about where's all these wild edibles in our lists, in our archaeobotanical lists, how representative they are. If we could manage to have a list of what they eat, except of most of them, of course, are agricultural products, but still how we would see them. So, because wild edibles, as you well know, all know, eaten while they are fresh, with no seeds, nothing. So, from the archaeobotanical point of view, how we could talk about the exploitation that we can see exploitation of plants through these archaeobotanical lists, because we have mostly seeds and all those other more solid stuff in archaeobotanical samples. So I think I could manage to tell you what I'm keep thinking
Yes,
of.
yes, yes.
Okay, tell me the answer.
Well, this is a very important point. And often what we do find is only a fraction of the range of species people would have collected or consumed. Obviously, we are missing all of the leafy greens. Sometimes they make appearances, but most of the time we're not able to capture these. We have a difficult time capturing the nuts, the tubers, and acorns if they are routinely crushed and mashed. So there are limitations, obviously, which is always the difficulty when we try to interpret how much certain plant remains or plants in general contribute to diet as a whole, which is one of the reasons why we are starting to question what is meant by broad spectrum or what is meant by a focused plant foraging practice, and whether this can actually be done based on archaeobotanical remains by themselves. So there are some things I suppose we could aim to do in the future to incorporate more starch and lipid analysis, as well as other range of plant remains into what we study. But I suspect the sad reality is we will never know everything, but we should be able to know what contributes to the diet in two main plant-based ways. One is what is consumed or prepared most frequently, and what may be contributing to the main source of plant-based calories into the diet. I think these two things we can know, but because one way or the other, they will show up either in the plant macro remains or in the plant micro remains. How we then go on to represent them as being more important than other plant remains or more important than animals is a big can of worms that I occasionally like opening when I am by myself with my books and my computer. But it's a very, very important question and a very important point you're raising. And obviously, we owe quite a lot to the work you have done and many others have done in archaeobotany to demonstrate that food is not the only source of seeds in archaeobotanical assemblages. And yeah, and other complications that arise from studying carbonized remains or otherwise plant remains. Yeah.
Ceren, thank you very much. I really appreciated your talk a lot and learn a lot. And I'm also very appreciated that culinary choices is now becoming mainstream thinking, and that's so important. And we started to understand that finally. And also wild plant gathering is kind of seasonal thing, but fresh eating is seasonal. Maybe, for example, acorns stored for a long time and tannin cleaned off and
Yes,
then eaten. So it's both collecting is seasonal, but eating in a different season. So
precisely.
Yeah.
This is a very important point, Fusun. If you think about it, anyone can do a very easy search on Google or YouTube and find all sorts of programs, okay? People tend to think about hunter-gatherer subsistence sometimes, that it is all berries and, you know, let's collect some berries, let's collect some seed plants, let's do some acorns, maybe some almonds, this and that, and then, okay, they eat them. But if you know better than anybody else that any of these plant groups to be converted into just edible foodstuffs to begin with,
yeah,
and then to be converted into foodstuffs that are actually desirable, you know, and nice to eat, and you go back to them, and you go back to collecting your tiny wild pistachios and your bitter wild almonds, and we find them everywhere. Okay, they must have been, and we know that with some primary evidence now, but they must have been very, very adept and developed very well, you know, routines of processing, and not just processing for detoxification, but processing as part of established culinary traditions and cultures, you know, to create regional patterns of enduring preferences and choices. And these things won't change overnight, simply because somebody threw in the mass the idea, okay, let's go and deal with gloom weeds now, which are a bugger to process, you know. And what for? Do you see what I mean? I tried to put it in a very crude nutshell now, excuse the pun, you know, but it is quite important to start thinking in terms of practices about these things, rather than just in terms of how many calories are in this, how many nutrients are in that.
Yeah.
Does it make sense? You know?
Thanks a lot.
That's it. Yeah, I think there are other questions. Okay.
Okay, it looks like Hojat is next.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you, Eleni, for your nice talk. Hopefully you hear me well and clearly.
Yeah. She's just gone to get some tea, but I will report back to her what she's saying. Sorry.
Okay, great. So I wanted to ask, so Avi, go ahead, please. Actually, I wanted to ask something from Eleni.
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
Me too.
Oh, really?
Okay.
Yeah.
She'll be back in 1 second.
Well, let's wait a minute, but it's fine.
I am here.
There you go.
Sorry,
All right.
a quick
So
departure.
go ahead.
I had to go and get a glass of water.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. So this is right now the putative idea concerning the main two pathway in terms of plant exploitation. If we compare Western fertile Crescent to the Eastern fertile Crescent, as you presented very well. So I wanted to highlight this, though at the same time we need to take this into account, the volume of excavation and the volume of data that we have from the two early millennia to the two first millennia of the early Holocene, the 10th and 9th specifically. As you present in your table, so your data all came from two sites, from the basal level, Sheikh Abad and Shora Golan. For example, in case of Shora Golan, all the information that we know from the site are coming from a looting, cleaning of a very, very small, less than 1 by 1 area, which was originally a looting pit. So I think it's really, yeah, it's okay, but it's a little bit, I think, too early to talk about Iranian and Iraqi Zagros. At the same time, we don't have the same site synchronous with Asia and with Sheikh Yabad, Basal Sheikh Yabad and Shogha Golan. Even in Eastern, in Western Zagros, in Iraqi Kurdistan, we don't have anything from Karim Shahir and Zawi Chemishanigar, at least in terms of archaeobotany. So yeah, I just wanted to say this. If you have any point, that would be great.
This is a very important point you are making. I think there is increasing evidence, at least from some the Iranian sites that have been published and studied so far, and I believe Amaya may be still here. Amaya, are you here? They published a paper recently looking at, the contribution of non-cereal large and medium seeded grasses in plant-based subsistence at these very early Holocene sites in this part of the Zagros. I am more than happy to stand corrected, but I would also like to emphasize that even in Eastern Anatolia, the amount of well-published assemblages is still low. One of the main points I hope that became communicated through our presentation is the importance of continuing to sample sites. The bioarchaeological heritage of humanity, that is the material residues of the plants and animals used by prehistoric communities in the past, is just as important as is the cultural, or if you want, the material culture heritage, okay? The lithics, the architecture, the pots, the pans, whatever. Global climate change means that a lot of this evidence is increasingly lost forever to archaeological investigation. We sampled Palegara, we were lucky. We hit materials, even though the preservation conditions were not ideal. Karim Shahir, an open air site a few kilometers to the west, of Palegara, gave nothing. Had it been sampled properly when it was first excavated in the mid-20th century, it would have given a lot. We sampled it with the same intensity and sampling coverage as we applied at Palegara, and literally there were what? Two charcoal flecks from tens of liters. It sort of redefines your, career choice to become an archaeobotanist when you're faced with such stark realities. I'm sure our archaeology colleagues still don't have to deal with such acute issues, but I would plead to them to think, for example, about latest trends in, later trends in stable isotope analysis. Our sampling, our testing of animal bone at Palegara for stable isotope preservation returned no preservation because of for collagen, because of the leaching. So yes, I agree with you. We need to sample more. We need to excavate more. But any excavation that starts today without a full sampling program, and it doesn't take much to set it up, is actually another lost opportunity. We need to do more. Absolutely.
Well, we also have a question from Avi. Avi,
Yes.
please.
Hi.
He asked for you.
Thank you.
Hi,
Thank you, Eleni, for your lecture. My question may be a bit general. if I understand well, you are basically giving up the protracted or pre-domestication cultivation constructs. Is it right? And if is this a certain kind of, I don't know, giving up coevolution and going into more cultural aspects of the process?
Well, I don't know. I don't give up anything. I don't espouse anything. I'm open to corrections. I don't know what is there to give up to begin with, to be absolutely honest with you.
You said protracted is not the case anymore.
Yes, but that, my understanding of the Anatolian evidence, my impression of it is that the transition, and I'm very hesitant, as you said, to use this term, because I don't believe even in the term transition anymore as such. It is so conceptually and philosophically loaded. It's a bit problematic, but regardless, the transition doesn't seem to have taken 3,000 years. And the reason for that is simple. There isn't a great or apparent, if you want, reliance on serial crop progenitors in the Eastern Fertile Crescent, or if you want, Eastern Anatolia, you know, that would, during the PPNA, that would justify something like this. At the same time, though, and I'm coming back to the points made by Hoxha earlier, how many epipaleolithic sites do we have from Anatolia, except from late epipaleolithic sites dating to the younger tribes? There is Kyortik Tepe, as far as I know, in the east.
Very few, yeah.
Okay? How many PPNA sites? There are a few, have been intensively sampled. A few, very intensively sampled. They show that every site has a different pattern of managing plants. And quite possibly, although there is context-related variation that is unaccounted for by the published reports, quite possibly this may reflect different culinary choices or environmental constraints, you name it, okay? So I hesitate, even in the PPNA sites, we know PPNA, so-called, although things change all the time, levels at Göbekli Tepe, we still have a 3-page report published in the early notice, you know, from this site. Not much to go by, not much to argue with. There is a sort of early PPNB assemblage from Neolithic that has been studied but never fully published, okay?
Yeah.
And, you know, some reconsiderations of it that are sometimes well quoted and sometimes misquoted, but at the end of the day, we don't have access to these old data sets, and Neolithic is now underwater. We can't go back to it. It again comes back to my original point. We need more data, well-collected data, well-published data, fully published data, not just summary counts of this and that and the other, you know, and if at all possible, access to older data sets and materials to be able to revisit them and reanalyze them and keep the debate open. One of the ways in which debates get stifled and paradigms are so long-lived is because we can't actually revisit the old data, or we can't collect new data to the degree that we would like to do. So my answer to your question is yes, provisionally, yes, with the provision that this seems to be applying in this specific region. But if you start asking me to talk to you about the southern Levant or the northern Levant or this and that, I would say, sorry, Avi, I pass. You won't get me on the record. Talking about things that I don't know much about.
So if I can add very quickly, in terms of the protracted model for domestication versus not, this is the situation. Is if the genomic evidence indicates a longer or shorter time span, this does not necessarily mean it has to be reflected in the archaeobotanical record. We talk as archaeologists of what people use and what evidence we have of collection or consumption or presence at sites. And if people are collecting plants and they are exerting serious anthropogenic impacts, we should hope that this is reflected in the genomic patterns, but this is not always the case. And I cannot necessarily tell you personally, because it is not within my area of expertise, whether this applies in all cases. What I do see as an archaeobotanist, having some small amount of experience in the region, is the story is almost always more complicated because we are dealing with very partial records. And what we are trying to do here is aim to decouple some of the paradigms so that we can gain greater and more detailed insights. So for example, there may be situations where we see shifts in long-term ecologies of plants that are reflected in what is being described as the protracted model. And we are supposed to accept that this has to relate to pre-domestication cultivation, but it may in fact be relating to broader patterns of ecological impacts that derive from the animals that are commensals within the sort of human landscape interactions and entanglements, let's say. Let's do an Ian Hodder. It may be reflecting broader ecological impacts because of climate change. Who knows? There are multiple possibilities, and what we want to do is start to look at these different possibilities, see if we can actually gain greater insights into the cultural processes, because as an archaeologist, I am more interested in what happens to people as opposed to what happens to a subspecies of wheat. If that makes sense.
It makes absolute sense.
Sorry,
Think about it.
I would love to debate what happens to a specific type of einkorn, but
yes, you can devise an
wheat is wheat. I mean,
yes, east is east and wheat is wheat. You can devise an algorithm that will tell you that in X variety of emmer wheat, a protracted transition, model would take X amount of X thousands of years to develop. Okay, fine, you can do that. But at the same time, I, as an archaeologist, look at the evidence, look at the presence, look at the limited metric data, look at the correlations and the context. And I go like, oh, that's interesting. This seems to be happening in the early sort of PP&B chronological horizon. What happens at the same time during this period? There is evidence for architectural complexity. There is evidence for intensified ritual behaviors. There is evidence for increasing management of animals. And I go like, hold on a second. All this together must be telling a story that wasn't there before. And its outcomes are not necessarily the same across the region. I mean, one of the most exciting aspects, and I was talking to Mary about that earlier, is the new data, high resolution data that come out from the site of Asouti, in an area that until now was considered completely outside the so-called fertile crescent. And you have fantastic evidence for local developments, that seem to, indicate a very different pathway compared to what we knew or sort of expected based on established paradigms until now. So let's accommodate that.
Who knows?
Great. Do we have any other comments, or this is a really stimulating discussion. Are there more comments or questions? Or are our brains full yet?
Sorry, guys, we tend to talk in paragraphs. I know this is tiring. And sometimes, you know, demotivating for participants.
No, I feel like I think many of us feel we've gotten a lot out of this talk, and there's a lot to think about, really a lot. Tip of the iceberg is a big problem, isn't it?
Yes,
When you
indeed.
look at the plant record, you see something so provocative, and yet
I would like just to emphasize to everyone, I realize that I see some comments in the chat that people found it provocative in the thought-provoking, not provocative, in the good sense. If you come up with questions afterwards, or if you want to establish, you know, a dialogue in your own time after you have digested some of these concepts, please do not hesitate to email us. You know, we can always talk. As a lot of you know, Mugi especially, hi Mugi. Maybe you have come up with a question by now, half an hour later, but I am always open to discussion and dialogue, you know.
Yes.
And I'm so sorry the pandemic has been so cruel to all of us, and I haven't seen most of you face to face, but you know, we are here. Email us, ping us, Zoom us, you know, we are here to talk about things.
Even if you want to say you're wrong.
Yes, even if you want to say, Eleni, you don't know what you're talking about. Ceren, don't talk to her anymore.
Yeah, that's fine.
Fine.
actually, if I could ask one, it's more technical, I guess, but I'm quite interested in the tuber exploitation, and you did talk a bit about that. What it's rushes essentially you think they're exploiting? Are they using the reeds at all? The tubers of the reeds?
I'm not entirely sure. We did have some cyperaceae in the PPNA and early PPNB, not in the PPNA, but in the early PPNB at Gifsir.
And we had a lot of them at Palegara.
Yeah, there was some, although they were in very bad state. So this is the problem, is especially yes, especially if there's any kind of soaking or mashing. We found them in very vitrified state at Palegara, which makes it almost impossible to identify what they are. But there are other sites that provide evidence for tubers in the Levant as well as in the Eastern Mediterranean. There's quite a bit, I think, unstudied, even from sites like Franthi Cave.
Yeah.
So there's bound to be a more complex story that relates to things like acorns, nuts, and tubers that we possibly don't really know about just yet. But
Well,
can I? Yeah, the Franthi Cave. You know, we published that paper in 2018 on the charcoal stuff.
Yeah.
These charcoal samples from Franthi Cave that had been sorted by Julie Hansen and sent to UCL Institute of Archaeology in the mid-90s proved to be also full of tubers as well as amorphous charred plant aggregates.
yeah.
Now, Ceren has started analyzing some of the charred plant aggregates and the tubers, and the paper that is currently under review contains some of the Franthi stuff, as well as materials from Shanidar Cave. We hope it will be published really soon. But really, work that has been done also by other colleagues in the region. Look, for example, at the work that Amaya Arantz has published from the southern Levantine sites, has really started just lifting the cover in this field. We are going to see much more exciting insights, many more exciting insights coming out of this. We are literally moving beyond a focus on, you know, if you want, the archaeologically recoverable and the easier to study things like what seeds are there, what chaff is there, what this and that and the other, to higher order analysis, more detailed analysis of materials that until very recently were just dumped by archaeobotanists, going into bags labeled as sort discard, you know.
Let's not be unfair.
So
but,
yeah, but this was what was happening until recently, because relatively recently, because the methodologies and the technology to investigate these things were not available.
Okay. One can't help but think that starch analysis will come in. I mean, I know chemically it depends on the conditions, but we're seeing in alkaline soils in the American Southwest that it really preserves very well.
Yeah, it is, and it is very interesting. There are some sites where, for example, the Shanidar work that Amanda Henry had done, which she had found some of the species that I don't find, and I have found stuff that she hasn't found, because it's some of the starch preservation is slightly different, and the identification criteria are also somewhat more ambiguous for certain taxa. So it's very complementary. Certainly, I think looking at things like starch and phytolith is going to be very informative. But at the same time, we still, there's strangely, even if we cannot necessarily see the species from the tubers, we can tell, for example, that they had high moisture content before they were carbonized. In some cases, you can see breakdown of the tissues because they'd been mashed. So that there are all sorts of things that we can perhaps think about looking at beyond species ID. I'm also quite keen on looking at certain things like mustards that could be used as flavorings, as opposed to contributing to calories. That I guess is the biggest culinary marker, because it is taste as opposed to bulk.
See, mustard seeds were quite ubiquitous at Palegara, but nobody thinks about talking about mustard seeds in pre-agricultural sites. And then you get to sites like Çatalhöyük, where you will find the concentration of zillions, gazillions of mustard seeds in one context, and you go like, how exciting. But you know, this how exciting aspect of plant related culinary practices may actually have a very long ancestry.
I mean, I think they had them in Jerf as well. Anyway,
yeah, Jerf El Ahmar as well. Yeah, sorry, Northern Syrian.
Can I? Yes, I can. I can send my email. Should I send it on?
Yeah.
Okay. So, is this? Where is your?
Let me do it.
I can't use your keyboard.
No.
Yeah.
Shoot.
Oh, look, Muge has a question. I think we better entertain. I know we're getting late, but this is, we need to hear from the lady who works at Ishikla.
I know, and with lots of
Hello again.
Wild plants.
Yeah, wild plants and mustard seeds. Yeah.
And,
hi.
Everything.
Hi.
Cryptic Asouti Ceren Kabukcu. Come on, spill out the beans.
So when I first raised my hand, I had a similar question in my head. So I could have asked it before, I guess. But among several things, one, I was thinking about these ubiquity and importance of nuts that you mentioned, and almonds. So it's always a question, of course, especially in this period, like, what do you think about the possibility of like a sort of management? So the relationship between that, those nuts and people in such early periods and in concept of East Fertile Crescent. So is there a sort of management? What extent can we see it? What is your...
Possibly, yeah. So, I mean, this is something that has been ongoing, and I'm working on looking at almond management with several people, because there are plenty of sites that we need to take into account, and we need to look at it in a very long time span. But there's potentially some indication that, especially with the early Neolithic, there is some more conscious management of almonds and potentially pistachios. But to what extent this is purely related to the creation of an anthropogenic habitat that is beneficial to trees versus pruning and active management is something that probably is going to take us another 5 years at the very least to untangle. And the difficulty is they are not annuals, and they're not even perennials. They are, and especially almonds are very resilient. So, which makes them very difficult to impact ecologically. So they survive really well in all conditions. But it also means that if you're nice to them, they don't necessarily reflect it immediately. But one thing we are using is sort of looking at the wood anatomy, some of the nutshell, and trying to couple that with the isotopes to see if we can trace changes. And it is proving very difficult. So potentially there is some management. Like we know there is management in oak, I can tell you that much, because they behave.
Yes,
but the almonds and the pistachios,
oaks behave, but
they don't behave.
Interestingly, Mary mentioned our most recent chapter on the latest Anamed volume. In it, we make specific reference to woodland management, like, emergent practices like, coppicing forms of pollarding and this and that, as the only viable ways through which a reasonable rate of regeneration could be sustained in the semi-arid inland regions of Southwest Asia. Meaning what? That if you leave these kind of woodland habitats alone and rely only on seed propagation for them to regenerate themselves, say you have a long-lived settlement like Ashukli or Çatalhöyük in the vicinity, and they have their goats, their sheep, their whatever, anything, plus the rate of seedling dieback and loss because of sharp fluctuations in soil moisture or nutrient availability, these habitats would not have been sustainable. You're better off managing developed shrubland and woodland trees, standing trees, and cut them down through pollarding or through coppicing.
No.
And this way you ensure that there is a continuous supply, not just of the wood, but also of the acorns, of the pistachio nuts, of all these things, rather than relying on nature to do its trick without you, engaging in a closer fashion. I'm not suggesting that this is a theoretical argument, okay? In practice, to show that from charcoal requires quite a lot of things to fall in place. Requires having large enough fragments, time, resources, etc., to do the data collection, you know, I really admire Ceren when she sits in front of the digital microscope and she puts a large fragment of oak, like she did from Çatalhöyük, for example, which is something I completely refuse to do for my PhD, because thankfully I didn't have to do it back then, you know. And she puts a large fragment, she goes like, okay, this is the outer ring, this is the angle, these are the rays, this go like this go like that. And then she starts measuring the ring width of each individual ring. And then she does that again for fragment number 1, fragment number 2, up to fragment one sample. And then go back and do it again and do it again, you know. God.
Okay,
this woman is my hero, you know. When
so
it comes
bottom
to
line
data
is,
collection.
bottom line is, we think there is at some point in the early Holocene a shift towards more exploitation for nuts, because we get to see more twigs from things like almonds and pistachio.
Yes.
That seems to be associated with faster growth.
Yes.
So potentially, as long as we get more evidence eventually, there is a shift towards the growth of more branches that are faster growing, potentially bearing more nuts and fruits. It looks to be that way. But it is going to require more sites and more evidence. So, but it looks like there is a shift.
If you want to see that as a fully published and fully supported scientific paper with data, it's going to take long days in front of the digital microscope, going click, click, click.
Yeah.
I just had my reply now, and I'm patient.
We ran into was to try to figure out what happens before, because the epipaleolithic charcoals are really problematic. The smaller pieces, it's hard to find enough comparable.
It's hard to find the ring band there.
But it is looking like they are looking like more managed and pruned.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I wish archaeobotany was as easy in terms of, you know, lifting a piece, going like, yeah, that's it, record, enter in the database as archaeology. Sorry, Mary, but it is.
But it's but interestingly, at the same time, it doesn't look like there's a shift in the nuts themselves. So it's a matter of how many. Anyway,
well,
come to Liverpool, we can talk about these things in great
very long answer, and I can
put you folks. I can put you in front of the digital microscope. You will hate me after that.
Well, you heard it, folks. They're inviting you to ask more questions in the future via email, etc. And hopefully we'll all continue these wonderful discussions in the future. And thank you, everyone, for your great questions and
thank you.
Excellent long answers. So thank you, both of you. We really enjoyed